Hello, I'm Michael Holmes. Today I'm excited to meet Jeffrey Sachs. I don't think you need an introduction, but you will get one anyway. You are a world-famous economist, professor at Columbia University. You've been the director of the UN Millennium Project, and you advised governments all around the world, China, Russia, Poland, many African countries, Latin American countries. I think you tried to advise the US, but they didn't listen to you. So,
well, I still try to advise them.
yeah, so today we're going to speak about your new book in German, which is called Diplomatie or Disaster. You are the best-selling author of many books in English and in German. And if we find the time, we're going to speak also about, because your new book is about the Ukraine war and the threat of nuclear war, nuclear Armageddon. And if we have the time, we speak about Gaza, Syria, and hopefully Taiwan.
Perfect.
Welcome, Professor Sachs.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Welcome to Germany. So the Ukraine war, you claim in your book, is the predictable outcome of 30 years of provocations by NATO expansion, by US support for the Maidan coup, the violent overthrow of the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, by the arming of a nationalist government. And you go through a long list of the West totally ignoring basic Russian security interests. And so my question to you is, did the West provoke Russia's invasion by crossing red line after red line after red line? This question is sort of suggestive now, but what do you say about that?
Yes, and yes. The United States has been out to weaken Russia or even to dismember Russia, as many in Washington talk about it, or to decolonize Russia, as some in Washington talk about it, for more than 30 years. It's important to understand, and it's fitting, of course, because Germany plays a big role in this story, that the modern story starts in 1990 with German reunification. That effectively was the end of World War II because there had been no treaty that ended World War II. That was because also there was no arrangement for mutual security in Europe. In 1990, of course, under Chancellor Kohl, Germany wanted to reunify. It wanted to reunify quickly. And in that context, it had a peacemaker in the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Right. And to bring about German reunification, the United States and Germany made an absolutely clear, solemn, and repeated promise. We have it on tape. We have it in endless documents. And that is that not only would the West not take advantage of the Soviet Union in the context of German reunification, but specifically, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That's the quotation of Secretary of State James Baker III, for example, on February 9th, 1990. This is not ambiguous. It's not even close. It's explicit. I happen to be an economic advisor for President Gorbachev. I think he was the greatest statesman of modern times. He was a peacemaker. He wanted German reunification. I know because I was an advisor to the Polish government, he facilitated the entry into the government in 1989 of the non-communist Solidarność opposition. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. I was part of the process. But the idea was peace in Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, immediately after that, the United States leaders said, this isn't about peace. This is about U.S. hegemony. This is about the U.S. being the sole superpower. Now we run the world. This was Cheney and Wolfowitz in the Department of Defense in 1992. Again, no doubt, it's all in documentary record. The idea was the Soviet Union is now gone. Now we, the United States, run the show. A lot of obnoxious, arrogant people took power in the United States, and their idea for the next 33 years, because it's until today, is this is now the U.S.-led world. Well, most of the world doesn't want to be led by the United States. Most of the world would like to cooperate with the United States, but not to be pulled around on a leash by the United States. And in particular, Russia and China do not want to be led by the United States. They would like to have peaceful cooperation. Not in the American mentality. The American mentality is, we won, you lost, now we decide everything. And in 1994, the basic decision was made. 1994, 31 years ago, by Bill Clinton, of course, by the U.S. security apparatus. Clinton is, the president. He comes and goes, but the security apparatus, I mean, the Pentagon, the CIA, and others, they run long-term U.S. foreign policy. And they said, okay, now NATO enlarges. Many diplomats said, well, wait a minute, we said no NATO enlargement. Come on, we won. This is our prerogative. And Bill Clinton signed off on NATO enlargement. And not just on NATO enlargement in 1994. What the historians are showing in the documentary record is already 30 years ago, it was all the way to Ukraine, all the way to Georgia. I would like people to look at a map. NATO's going to be in the Caucasus, and this is somehow consistent with Russian security? Are we crazy? Donald Trump would not tolerate a Chinese or Russian military base thousands of miles from the U.S. border. Here we're supposed to be right at the Russian border. Now, the Europeans understood all of this. Not a great idea. Pretty dangerous. Keep calm. Don't provoke. But the United States doesn't listen to Europe. I'm sorry to give away the secret, but the United States treats the European leaders like, we do what we want. You follow. You abide by our dictates, and that's it. And of course, a big showdown came in 2008. And, former Chancellor Angela Merkel has written about this in her memoirs, how she opposed in 2008 George W. Bush Jr.'s demand that NATO commit to a date and a roadmap for Ukraine and Georgia to join. And she knew this was a bad idea, and other European leaders knew that it was a bad idea. Now, it's fascinating what happened. What happened was the United States put its foot down. Okay, Chancellor Merkel said, we're not going to sign a specific date. But what came out of the Bucharest summit in 2008? Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO. And she signed that. She agreed to that. So did the other European leaders. One of them called me afterwards and said, what is your president doing? This is against the promises that he made to Europe. We were told U.S. wasn't going to press this. The U.S. pressed it. The European leaders fell into line. And that was, to my mind, the last moment of European diplomacy until today. Because basically, from then until today, the U.S. has been calling the shots. Now, all of this has led to war, because Russia has said, without question, no, you will not have your missile systems, you will not have your military bases on our border. A few minutes missile time from Moscow. No, you will not do it. And by the way, Donald Trump, he thinks we need to own Canada for U.S. security. He thinks we need to own Greenland for U.S. security. He thinks we need to own Panama for U.S. security. Well, all President Putin is saying is don't put your military bases and your missiles on our border. If we were grown-ups, we'd say, yeah, that's a point. We should avoid World War III. We should avoid that provocation. I know many European leaders privately are grown-ups, but publicly they're children. They just fall into line with what the United States says. And if the United States says, this war has nothing to do with NATO enlargement, then the European leaders say, this war has nothing to do with NATO enlargement. And the game is played where it obviously does. And I think just to conclude on this basic point, it's not just the NATO enlargement, it's the context in which this is happening. In 2002, the United States broke the equilibrium of nuclear arms control by unilaterally abandoning the anti-ballistic missile treaty. I think people really need to understand that this was a massively destabilizing action. And if you go back then until now, how many times have Russian leaders said, this is destabilizing. This gives you a provocation for a first strike, a decapitation strike. We don't want these missile systems. We don't want Aegis missile systems in Poland. We don't want Aegis missile systems in Romania. We certainly don't want Aegis missile systems in Ukraine. In 2019, the United States unilaterally walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, saying, yes, we'll put intermediate nuclear missiles where we want. The U.S. walked out of the Open Skies Agreement. Basically, the United States, and I think it is so profoundly reckless, broke the nuclear arms framework unilaterally. And it's in that context that this NATO enlargement is especially provocative, because it's NATO enlargement without nuclear arms control. I could mention 100 other kinds of provocations. Bombing Belgrade for 78 straight days in 1999, good idea, not a very good idea. Breaking Serbia in two and declaring that Kosovo is an independent state, and then putting the largest NATO military base in Kosovo, Bondesteel, the largest base in southeastern Europe after breaking the country in two with 78 days of bombing. Is that building trust? Is that grown-up behavior? Or is that a kind of thuggery, which it in fact is? Going to war all over the Middle East, in Iraq, on completely phony pretenses, destabilizing Syria starting in 2011 in a CIA operation, Timber Sycamore, using NATO to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, and conspiring in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. Is it any wonder that we're at war right now? And then why did the mainstream media in the United States and in Europe say, oh, 2022 completely unprovoked? Because they take their script from the U.S. security state, as do the European leaders, which is very sad, because Europe knows a lot more about this than the United States does. The U.S. side, I know it. I know these people. I know them personally. I deal with them all my life. They're arrogant. They're stupid. They don't even know basic geography. They don't know what they're doing. They just think that they're in control. If European leaders said, really, this is not a good idea. This is provocative. This is destabilizing. Let's make peace. Let's listen to Russia, not just bulldoze the situation. Europe would be more secure. It would be more stable. It would be at peace. It would not be in this absurd, reckless campaign right now of Rutte and others. 5% of GDP in military spending. Are you kidding? How about a day of no-cost talking to Russia rather than 5% of GDP. By the way, to buy U.S. arms that aren't even working on the battlefield in Ukraine. The whole thing is rather frustrating, is what it is.
It is, and I have to say in the book you go in great detail into the coup in 2014 against Viktor Yanukovych, and you show, I think, that it was a coup, and
of course it was a coup.
Against the elected government.
And by the way, just if I could say,
sure,
on February 21st, 2014, 3 European foreign ministers negotiated an arrangement where Yanukovych would stay in power for several months. There would be a unity government and there would be new national elections.
Right.
The next day, there was a violent overthrow, and within a nanosecond, the United States recognized the new government. And what did Europe say? Did Europe say, excuse me, we had an agreement, we also had an understanding with President Putin, there's a constitutional process, Yanukovych needs to come back, these violent demonstrators should not be recognized? No, Europe said, thank you, United States, we'll do whatever you say. Mm-hmm. Come on, this is not security. This is not sensible. This is not keeping anybody safe.
And you show in the book that this coup was spearheaded by the right sector, like radical right-wing groups in Ukraine. That's not meant to discredit the whole of the Maidan movement. I think the majority of the people actually were just opposed to corruption and authoritarian tendencies in Yanukovych. But it was done against the elected government by extreme right-wing forces, and I think you show that clearly. But
I've seen a number of these U.S. events, let's call them. When the Maidan started, suddenly there were new television stations all over Ukraine. There were new media outlets all over Ukraine. There were new reporters all over Ukraine. There were people organized. There were people being bussed into Kyiv and so forth. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen spontaneously.
No.
That is organized. I happened to be in the Maidan a few weeks after February 24th, 2014. There were still people camped out in the Maidan. I was taken around the Maidan by somebody who explained to me how money was paid to organize that resistance that I was seeing before my eyes. Oh, he was paid 10,000 US. This one was paid 15,000. This is whatever some people come or didn't come. There was a lot of US in that, believe me. I know it. I saw it with my own eyes. Not to mention the fact that US senators were there pumping up the crowds, and Victoria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and is now my colleague at Columbia University, was out there passing around cookies, so-called, and more than cookies, bigger goodies, actually. She, at one point, said, well, we spent $5 billion to promote democracy in Ukraine. I know what that means. The U.S. should not be doing this on Russia's border. I don't want China overthrowing the Mexican government. I don't want China meddling in the Canadian government. I really don't. It would not feel good for American security. I don't want Russia doing that. When Russia, in analogous circumstances in 1962, said that it would put a military base and nuclear arms in Cuba, we nearly had the end of the world in the October 1962 missile crisis. The great powers should give each other space, not be face-to-face with each other, not be provoking each other, not be taunting each other, not be saying, oh, he's bluffing until the world ends. And then you don't even have time to say, oh, excuse me, I was wrong. This is how we should not be behaving. We should be giving each other space, the major powers.
I have to say my partner is Mexican, and she's very scared of the United States, as all Mexicans are, especially at the moment, and as in the past so often. But she doesn't want any help from China or Russia.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
it's like,
By the way,
because, like,
you could imagine that a Mexican government would say, "Ooh, we've got Donald Trump on our northern border. He's making demands, so we better have, a great power come in."
yeah, they are tempted, I tell you.
This would not be a good idea, honestly.
Right.
This
No.
would be the destruction of Mexico, and it would be the end of the world. Quite
And they know
possibly.
that. Mexicans
I
know
know
that.
they do. I know they
Yeah.
do.
So in 2022, we were pretty close to a peace agreement in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine, as you show in your book. The US and Britain derailed it. Could you outline the key points of that agreement? And is a similar peace deal still possible? What do you think?
The agreement in 2022 was actually quite straightforward. It had three components in essence. One was Ukraine would be neutral, period. This is the fundamental issue for Russia. What does neutral mean? It means U.S. keep out of our neighborhood, period. That's what it means, basically. We don't want your missiles. We don't want your bases. We don't want your troops. We don't want your CIA operating all over the place. We want a neutral Ukraine. So that was the first point. The second point, quite interestingly, was not a demand for territory in the Donbass. It was essentially to implement what Germany was guarantor of, and that is the Minsk II agreement. Right. Now, this is, again, another real disappointment for me about Chancellor Merkel, who I really respected and thought she's extremely competent, but she gave in to the U.S. too many times. And in Minsk II, Germany was a guarantor of an agreement backed by the UN Security Council that said the Donbass would have autonomy within Ukraine. Not that it would become Russian, it would be an autonomous region, something like the Tyrol, Bolzano in Italy. In fact, it was really modeled on the situation in the Italian Alps, where you have a German-speaking population, and it has autonomy, but it's Italy. There's no question. And that was the idea for the Donbass. And the United States and the Ukrainians said, yeah, it's an agreement, but it was with a gun to our head. We don't have to do that. Security Council notwithstanding, Normandy process notwithstanding, German guarantee notwithstanding, blow it off. And in Istanbul, the idea was implemented. Thank you. We don't demand that territory. The third part was security guarantees that would be implemented for Ukraine, but not covering the autonomous regions and not covering Crimea, which was going to stay in Russian hands. And the basic point of Crimea is also, I think, obvious, but needs to be stated. Crimea is the base of the Russian naval fleet. It's been the naval base for Russia since Catherine the Great in 1783. This goes back basically longer than the United States of America has existed, because our Constitution is 1787 and our United States started in 1789. So this goes back before the United States even was a baby. Russia did not want Crimea to fall into NATO hands. And that's why immediately after the coup in 2014, they took back Crimea. They did it with a referendum, which probably expressed the real views of the Russians living in Crimea, but notwithstanding, no matter what, it wasn't going to happen, because the Russians were not stupid. They knew what NATO wanted. The whole point of this was to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. This isn't even a secret. Zbigniew Brzezinski spelled out the U.S. strategy, which was to make Russia a second-rate, third-rate, fourth-rate power by basically taking Ukraine to, quote, our side and leaving Russia without a Black Sea outlet, without ability to move its navy into the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East and so forth. So this isn't even a secret. And so the Russians didn't want that. To come back to Istanbul, March 2022, it was a very straightforward agreement. The agreement was neutrality. We don't want your Donbass, but you have to do the Minsk II agreement, and Ukraine is ours, and we'll arrange security guarantees. The United States, deep state, said no. We have a 30-year project. We actually want this war to continue. We want to weaken Russia, as our Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin explained publicly. We have had a president then, Biden, who said publicly that man, meaning Putin, cannot stay in office. Quite an extraordinary thing that the United States decides who's the Russian president. Not just who the Ukrainian president is, but who the Russian president should be. So they didn't want to stop the war. What we've recently learned, by the way, is that starting just around that time was an intensive R&D effort to build a drone capacity in Ukraine. And, you know, war is an experimental laboratory for the United States. War in Ukraine, very convenient, no Americans dying, or very, very few. And we get to experiment. We get to develop drone warfare. We see how electronic warfare is going to work. We understand the new battlefield. After all, say these crazy compatriots of mine, we have to prepare for war with China. This is a little bit of a sideshow, but it's not a bad testing ground for our weapon systems. So recently, Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor of Biden, described how, yes, we started a big effort. He was very proud of it, to make advanced drone weapons. So I think they didn't want the war to end prematurely. This would be a mistake. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't count the dead, by the way. They just don't even discuss the dead. And if the issue of the dead comes up, because it's an unpleasant issue after all, they make up completely phony numbers. I just read in the New York Times an absurd article saying that Ukraine has lost 100,000 dead and wounded. Are you kidding? It probably, when the dust has settled and demographers can actually do their work, we're going to find out it's probably 1 million dead and wounded. But the New York Times, with a straight face, and I find the paper so shamefully devoid of facts. But in any event, it said 100,000. But the real point is, you know, if you want to be a tough world empire, you don't count the dead. And the United States doesn't count the dead. So Ukraine has been basically destroyed in this process, but the U.S. got its weapon systems tested. The U.S. Thinks that it weakened Russia. Until today, we hear these deep state murmurings, and Trump repeated some deep state foolishness just yesterday, that Russia's on the ropes, the economy's collapsing, and so forth. This is the kind of the dream world in which this policy is made.
Yeah. Gaza has been destroyed even more, much more,
yes,
than Ukraine. And I have to say, I've been used to Western hypocrisy as you are for many years, but I was still a bit taken aback, and I still find it a bit hard to believe that the US, Britain, and Germany support Israel so, 100% in this genocide. And I think it needs to be called that. And you, in your book, you you criticize this basic narrative in the West by politicians and most journalists of a global battle between the good democracies, not just good, but fundamentally good, like the forces of light, against the evil dictatorships like Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, and so on. And first of all, it's so cliche. And even if they, on balance, would be a bit better, it's still a long stretch to make it into this big Manichaean, super stark dichotomy of totally good against totally evil, because that's what they do. And Gaza, I think, has completely destroyed this narrative. Certainly for all the global South, the whole world, despite the West, which is a minority in the world, the rest of the world just looks at Gaza and see, that is our point. You think you're better just because you're liberal democracies and so on. And I don't think that, I think most of the people in the world would like to have a liberal democracy and rule of law and a modern economy and so that. I don't think they're opposed to the West, basically opposed to the Western model of running things. It's just that they remember colonial days and they know the dark side of the West, and they look at Gaza and they say, see, that's the dark side of you. And we're fed up of being lectured by you. So I feel like Gaza is a real turning point. I hope the ceasefire holds. It's a surprise that Trump seems to be responsible for it. But it was a genocide. The West supported it. And I find it stunning and shocking. So I would like you to comment on this.
Let me talk about several different dimensions of what you have just said, which I concur with. First is the issue of democracy and peace. Unfortunately, they're not very closely related. And if you go back to ancient history, the wonderful democracy of Athens in the 5th century BC was the imperialist power of the Aegean region, and it beat up the other city-states, and it was very militarized. It had lots of demagogues that wanted war. Of course, one of the reasons it ended up being defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars is that it went off into a completely ridiculous adventure in Syracusa in Sicily, and it failed terribly. But it was militaristic. It wasn't peace-loving. It was a democracy, but it was completely militaristic. But we don't have to go back so far. I just point that out to say that there's nothing about democracy and peace intrinsically. In the 19th century, it is right to say that Britain was the most democratic nation in the world. Hands down, no question, the most violent nation in the world, period. No doubt.
That was a good thing. It was a good thing in a way.
The British,
for Britain.
the British Empire was very powerful. It took over at its peak around 1/4 of the entire landmass of the world. It had its crown jewel in India. There was a lot of terrible cruelty to the empire, by the way, because when famines came and El Niños hit in the second half of the 19th century, the British just left Indians to die by the millions. And but here was a democracy completely militarized. What's the value of that? Now, in the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. is by far the most militaristic country in the world. It fights wars every year, everywhere. It's a democracy. It's now as much a plutocracy as a democracy because I think money votes even more than people vote in the U.S. Hence, our de facto prime minister is Elon Musk, because he basically helped finance Trump's election. But the point is, yeah, democracy, but extremely violent, overthrowing governments, coups, color revolutions, overt wars of choice on false pretenses, and all the rest. So this standard democracy good, autocracy bad, this is childish. Maybe the politicians should go back to school for just a few weeks and learn some history or gain some perspective, or just stop the endless chatter and rhetoric. You look at China. I think Mr. Mertz recently said how dangerous China is. It's an autocracy. It doesn't have our values. China hasn't been to war one time for the last 45 years. 45 years. And the last time China was at war, it was 1 month. 1 month, mid-January to mid-February 1979, in a kind of slap of the wrist of Vietnam for having overthrown a Chinese ally in Cambodia. That's it. China doesn't do war. We do war all the time. And then they're evil. We're wonderful. What's so wonderful about that? About all this militarism? So the hypocrisy.
And let me mention that the war against Vietnam by China was supported by the CIA. We have some evidence for that now, because of course it was against the arch enemy of the Vietnamese communists.
Yes.
So the only war that China fought in the last 100 years was with the support of the US.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is so why do we discuss things in this childish way, and end up in so much bloodshed and so much falsity? Now we come to Gaza. Well, this is a genocide before our eyes. Mm-hmm. It's not even subtle, because you have these absolute extremists. Two cabinet ministers, one has recently resigned, Ben-Gvir, and the other Smotrich, who is still tentatively in the government, who talk openly about ethnic cleansing or destroying the Palestinian people, or expelling them from Palestine, or ruling over them, because there's no subtlety to it. They will dominate all of the territories from the river to the sea. Incidentally, in the US, when students, pro-Palestinian students, said from the river to the sea, the police were called on them. But the river to the sea is the actual policy of Netanyahu's government, of the Likud party, which says that's all Israel's.
Right.
It's incredible. There's no sense of perspective. Stand back a little bit and understand what this is about. Now, just like in Ukraine, the core issue in Ukraine is the U.S. up against the Russian border. By every means, that's all that's at stake. In other words, if the United States says we won't do that, the war ends. The war in Gaza right now is all about one thing, which is that Israel says there will be no state of Palestine, no two-state solution, no peaceful coexistence between two peoples, no one state of democratic equality, nor two states living side by side, neither. Because the explicit policy of Israel, explicit, is we control everything. This has been Netanyahu's project his entire political career, which is now almost 30 years since he became prime minister. And it's the explicit policy of his party, the Likud. And then it's been joined by even more zealous so-called religious nationalist parties who take their cue from ancient texts which say, kill all the people there, this is the land promised by God to the Jewish people, and so forth, and taken literally, which is, we can do whatever we want. This is our land, doesn't matter who's there. So there has been a bloodbath, there has been a slaughter. Every day it's U.S. weapons, every day it's U.S. finance. And so the U.S. is complicit from morning till night, till morning till night, in this slaughter that has been going on. And the rest of the world is watching in dismay, horror, amazement, incredible consternation, but kind of a paralysis right now, what to do when Israel has no self-constraint and the United States does nothing, not anything for a single moment under the Biden administration to cause any restraint. The ceasefire that came in now is because of Trump, 100%. Blinken pushing Israel to a ceasefire? Are you kidding? We watched that show. It's impossible. It was absolutely ridiculous. To his credit, Trump said, I want a ceasefire before I come into office. And he sent his business buddy, Steve Witkoff, and apparently the Israelis trying to delay, said, don't come on the Sabbath. And Witkoff said, I'm showing up in your office tomorrow, no matter what day of the week it is. And he told them, you sign. And they signed. Now, what does this show, by the way? It shows that at any moment, the United States can end this. It's just like in Ukraine. This does not depend on Zelensky. He could fight with the sticks and stones, but if he wants missiles and armaments, it's the United States. Right. So the U.S. can end this any moment. With Israel, Israel cannot fight a single day without the United States support. Well, the Biden administration was completely complicit in this. I do expect that the International Court of Justice will find that Israel is in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. In other words, I do expect that this will be declared by the highest court in the world to be a genocide because the evidence is absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah, you have shown in a couple of articles, and I was surprised because you were so clear about that, that the U.S., like in Syria, that the U.S. And their allies, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, supported radical Islamist groups. They knew that they were supporting them. Among them, Al-Qaeda, who were celebrating 9/11. And I think very few people understood that in the US and in Europe. You very clearly condemned this. Can you say a bit about that? Because they just came to power. They now claim that they're more moderate, and hopefully they are at least a little more moderate than they were in the past, because they are Al-Qaeda. And so can you say a bit about what happened during the Syrian civil war?
First of all, I think it's really important for people to understand whether it's the Maidan and all the financing that goes with it, or whether it is Al-Qaeda or the Syrian civil war, so-called. These are expensive, organized efforts. It's not cheap to pull out some change and buy a tank or anti-tank missiles or other armaments. These are big, expensive operations. The point is they're well organized, they're well financed. Typically, the CIA does a lot of that organization and financing. That's its role. Now, what is a very basic point is the CIA was established in 1947, basically as a secret army for the president or the security state of the United States. And its mission from 1947 until today has been to bring down the Soviet Union, then to bring down Russia. Of course, it has brought down dozens of other governments as well, because Another part is if one day in the White House somebody briefs the president and says, we don't think that guy's a good guy, typically it ends up, well, get rid of him. President usually doesn't say assassinate him, or maybe never says that, but says, well, he's inconvenient. And then something happens, like what happened to Mr. Lumumba in the DRC,
Congo.
or what happens then the Congo, the Belgian Congo, or what happens, or the newly independent Congo, or well, there are countless cases of this.
Over 50.
So when the CIA got going, it realized a basic geographic point, which is that the kind of the periphery of Russia is Islamic regions. And therefore, one way to go after the Soviet Union was to arm Muslim fighters fighting for their religion or fighting their national cause. And so the link of the CIA and Islamist fighters goes back to the 40s and the 1950s. It's not something recent. In its recent incarnation, it started in 1979 when Zbig Brzezinski had this clever idea to entrap the Soviet Union in Afghanistan by the US CIA funding and arming the Mujahideen, which was the Islamist fighters coming from the Middle East to Afghanistan to antagonize, threaten, or overthrow the Soviet-backed government. And Brzezinski was very pleased with himself, saying that this is the bait for the Soviets to invade, and then that will be their Vietnam. And in some ways it was, and Brzezinski was more or less content to sacrifice Afghanistan to the cause of fighting the Soviet Union, because basically Afghanistan was destroyed. It went from 1979 until today that Afghanistan was destroyed by this little adventure. Now, one of the people that came to Afghanistan, of course, was Osama bin Laden.
Right.
And he was the founder of Al-Qaeda, meaning the base or the foundation.
Right.
But that was the American, he was a CIA paid person. He did get disgusted with the U.S. hypocrisy. He got disgusted with what he regarded as American insults to the Islamic world and to his own country, Saudi Arabia. He wrote all of this in a letter to Americans in 2002 after 9/11. But this is solid documentary history. So the idea, oh, shock, Al-Qaeda somehow U.S.-backed? Well, come on, please grow up. This has been a process for many, many decades. In 2011, President Obama, at the deep state instigation, and I think basically at Netanyahu's instigation, decided that the CIA would work with the countries you mentioned to topple Bashar al-Assad. And in 2012, Obama signed Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the presidential finding assigning the CIA with the operation of the objective of overthrowing Bashar al-Assad, something that happened at the end of 2024. So that was a long adventure, several 100,000 deaths. But as I say, the U.S. doesn't count the dead. This was a, quote, successful operation. But of course, this is a long story, and it's part of a long history, and there's a lot of continuity to American foreign policy. I just find it pretty abhorrent how much violence and bloodshed there is in it.
Yeah, we just have a few minutes left, so I suggest we end with the worst case scenario, because you write in your book there is, it's probably not a good chance, but it's a small chance that, the Ukraine war will end up in nuclear Armageddon. You try to show that we are in the most when it comes to nuclear weapons, in the most dangerous period since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And even if the chance is small, the result would be the end of like 90% of mankind, like basically 1,000 Holocausts. Sounds so exaggerated, but it wouldn't be. How can this be? Like, how did we get so close to the brink of nuclear total annihilation today? Let's end on a bad note.
You know, making the atomic bomb was a work of scientific genius. And it took the leading scientists of the age to understand that such a weapon was feasible and that it depended on the new quantum mechanics and the atomic physics, and that fission in a self-sustaining way was possible. Of course, it was leading German scientists in the 1930s that discovered a lot of this process. Many of them came to the United States and were part of the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. I mention this because one of my wonderful colleagues at Columbia University said we were smart enough to develop the bomb, we should be smart enough to control it. And I just added a footnote, which is a few geniuses were smart enough to develop the bomb, and then they gave it to a bunch of idiots who are managing the bomb.
Right.
The physicists knew right at the beginning, oh my God. Some of them said after Germany's defeat in May 1945, let's stop the Manhattan Project before it even completes. This is too dangerous. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, Robert Oppenheimer, who was heading the Manhattan Project, kind of in a pride that we've brought it this far, said, no, we should finish it and then control it. But he quickly lost control to the U.S. security state, which took over, said to the scientists, thank you very much, removed Oppenheimer's security clearance, and the bomb fell into the hands of a bunch of violent, narrow-minded, and pretty ignorant people who are the leaders of the U.S. deep state. Now, this is our situation, which is that you have genius, Edward Teller, who was the so-called father of the thermonuclear bomb, which brings total annihilation within reach, was a physics genius. But honestly, did we have to develop the thermonuclear bomb so that now we're at the knife edge of survival of humanity itself? And then who runs things afterwards? So the physicists, they have felt for decades now, by and large, with a few exceptions, we've got urgently to get this under control. And in 1947, they unveiled a graphic explanation, help to the U.S. public and the world public, called the Doomsday Clock, to say how close are we to nuclear Armageddon. And they set the minute hand at 7 minutes to midnight in 1947. And that minute hand during peace has gone farther away from midnight to 17 minutes to midnight in 1992, after the supposed end of the Cold War. But then with the Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump won, and Biden won, every American president has brought that hand closer to midnight, so that today the clock is at 90 seconds to nuclear Armageddon. And I know that the Bulletin is about to release an update later in this month, actually, at the end of January 2025. So we'll see what their judgment is at this moment. 90 seconds is too close to comfort. We're talking about the possible end of the world. And last year in the U.S., there was a bestseller book, an extraordinary book called Nuclear War, A Scenario, by an investigative journalist named Annie Jacobson, which describes minute to minute, sometimes second to second, how a total nuclear war unfolds over a 2-hour period to destroy the world, all based on generally declassified, but the serious analytics of how such a war would unfold. It's horrifying. I listened to it as an audiobook. It's horrifying to read. It's horrifying to listen to as an audiobook, but it's necessary reading because this is really our situation right now. Now, at the end of 2024, Biden or people acting in Biden's name authorized the use of U.S. attack of missiles to strike deep inside of Russia. Putin had already said, that's a red line. When you use attack of missiles, that's not Ukraine doing that. That is U.S. Military targeting those missiles, guiding those missiles. That cannot be done by Ukrainians. Right. Ukraine may say, press the button, so-called, but it's Americans that are actually deploying those weapons. And now they're deploying those weapons to hit inside Russia. And then when you hear, well, this could escalate to nuclear war, then our absolutely foolish politicians say, oh, don't be bluffed. Don't give in to nuclear blackmail. Please, these politicians are absolutely disgusting, insufferable. I don't want to know after the fact that, oh, it wasn't a bluff. They won't even have the time to tell me it wasn't a bluff. We should not be shooting missiles deep into Russia and then figuring out, well, was it a 1% chance that it was a bluff or a 5% chance that it was a bluff? And maybe, sorry, it wasn't a bluff. I'm so sorry, I misjudged. What are we doing? This is sheer, reckless, useless, senseless provocation. It happened, by the way, with a U.S. president that we are learning more and more was mentally incapacitated by the end of his term. Not all there. He's an old man, and he's gone away. Somebody signed an order in his name. Maybe he understood, maybe he didn't understand. I don't care if he was, 50 years old and completely with it. This was a reckless order. Now, just to say in the German context, please do not send Taurus missiles into this mess right now. Germany is right there. That is useless. It accomplishes nothing except raise the stakes for nuclear war. Please don't do it for all of our sake, because the nuclear war isn't going to stop in Germany. It's not going to stop in Ukraine. If it happens, it's going to destroy the world. Stop being reckless. Go to Moscow or invite President Putin to come to Berlin and negotiate and discuss. It's not sending missiles against each other and then figuring out after the fact, was it a bluff or wasn't it a bluff?
Professor Sachs, I would like to thank you. I would also like to thank you for being, for many decades, you've been a voice of the voiceless, sorry for being a bit romantic here almost, but you've also spoken up often for the poorest of the poor, the extreme poor. There are about 1 billion people around the world today. We didn't speak about poverty today and the economic system and its injustices around the world. But I've been to Africa and India, and I've often been shocked by children without enough food, without shoes and so on. And so I would like to thank you for that. You always try to make the rich countries do more about that, about extreme poverty. And in recent years, you've been a voice for the people who were affected by the West's wars. Of course, you care about dictatorships too and the wars of Russia and China, but you are an American, so you take that responsibility.
If I could just say,
Sure.
The reason I I pursue this is that I was lucky to grow up in a comfortable, safe, and secure environment. I grew up in an upper middle class family. I was able and was blessed to have a good education. And as an economist, I know we are so rich in this world. It's not like I'm saying, well, there are poor and we should make every sacrifice. I'm saying something actually a little different, which is there are poor and we are so rich beyond imagining.
Right.
And we're not even helping a child to be in school. Are we kidding? Could this conceivably be the right way to organize our lives, to make a safe planet, to live in a decent feeling? So I'm not calling for moral heroics. I'm calling for basic sense.
Yes.
Let's not blow ourselves up. Let's stop the wars, and let's help people who have nothing have enough to survive with dignity and get on with their lives.
Yes. And also, I didn't mean to put you in the box of like just a bleeding heart leftist without a brain. You are a great scientist, and you do want to make things work for the poor.
Yes.
But they do need compassion, and they do need resources
and
also.
We need some sense. Some
common
basic
sense.
Common sense.
Yes. So I thank you so much, Professor Sachs.
It's great to be with you.
It was a
Appreciate
pleasure.
it. Thank you.